The meeting to order. Ms. Kinchin, would you call roll, please?
Chairman Hawes,
Here.
Ms. Krupa, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Garrett, Ms. Cage,
Present.
Mr. Whitty,
Here.
Mr. Bro,
Here.
Ms. Goodson,
Here.
Mr. Broussard,
Here.
Mr. Tingle, Mr. Ince, Ms. Gotro,
Here.
Mr. Burke, Ms. Salings Gorman,
Here.
Mr. Elmers,
Here.
Mr. Bourgeois, Mr. Hidalgo, Ms. Cormier, Mr. Segrera,
Here.
Ms. President McGinnis,
Here.
Representative Zarang, Senator Henskins. You have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Inger. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda? Motion by Mr. Hidalgo, second by Ms. Salins Gorman. Any public comment? Any objection? Hearing none, that motion carries. Agenda item number 4, approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes? Again, motion by Mr. Hidalgo, second by Mr. Helmers. Any public comment? Any objection? Hearing none, that motion carries. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on to agenda item number 5, old business or announcements. Do any members of the board have any old business? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Gotro. You press your button.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to announce that the Governor's Coastal Advisory Commission is going to be meeting on Wednesday, July 26, 2023, from 10 to 12 in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And if you will check the CPRA website and your email for additional information about the location and the agenda, which will be coming in the next few weeks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Gotro, for that. Appreciate it. Any other announcements or old business from the board? All right, well, hearing none, we'll invite Mr. Grandy to the table for the implementation update, agenda item number 6.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'll start out the implementation updates. We currently have 109 active projects, 41 in construction, 65 in engineering, design, 3 in planning. Of the projects, the category that has most in construction currently are hurricane protection. The category that has most in engineering and design and most total projects is marsh creation. If you look down at the bottom column or bottom row under other, you'll see one project in construction under the other, and that's the project that we'll highlight today, the Bayou Lafourche pumping capacity improvement projects. This project received a notice to proceed in November of 2022. Estimated construction completion date is mid-2025. The progress to date highlights, luckily we were able to make significant progress on material staging and outfall area work while the riverside was paused for High River earlier this year in March and April. We don't currently have High River, which is a good thing for the project where it is at this point in time. Unfortunately, as a reminder for one of the reasons this project is so importantly, just recently the Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District reported low water levels in the bayou, mainly due to the Mississippi River being so low. In a news release, the Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District reported one of the 4 pumps it uses to draw water from the river and increase the bayou's flow is out for repair. And on July 1st, another one went down to a large-scale power outage in the Donaldsonville area. The water's getting so low in some of the districts that depend on the bayou that it's threatening their water supply. The Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District reported it's actively working to restore the 4th pump as quickly as possible, but this underscores the need to improve the pumping capacity on Bayou Lafourche so we don't continue to encounter issues like this in the future. So as we take a look at some of the work on the Mississippi River intake side, the new pump station side, you can see 24-inch piles that are being installed for the foundation of the new pump station structure. This will be followed later this month with installation of sheet pile walls for the temporary retaining structure. On the outfall side, where the pumped water will enter Bayou Lafourche, there's been extensive demo work, clearing of that area, which you can see in the bottom right of that picture, driving of 16-inch piles and to support the discharge box walls. And as we take a look at the video, we're looking towards the riverside. You can see the existing Bayou Lafourche pump station on the left, pumping capacity 450 CFS, and then piles for the new foundation on the right as we zoom in and take a closer look at those piles and all the work. And you can see the low river for this particular portion of work is really helping the folks be able to do that work in the dry and make a little progress that they wouldn't be able to make otherwise. As you take a look with a bird's eye view coming in from the river, you can see the old pump station, the new pump station to the left, and then as we look down, you can see the outfall from the current pump station as it's pumping water into Bayou Lafourche. That work at the left, the demo and the clearing in that particular area, and work progressing pretty well according to schedule. We'll zoom back around and take a look back towards the river, and you'll get a good look at that clearing area, the outfall from the current pump stations, and the material that's been staged in that particular area. This project, the design of this project is being led by the Design Prime Stantec and their subconsultants, Delta Coast Consultants, Baird, Tetra Tech, Lanier and Associates, Cavu, Terra Explorations, and P&D. The construction part of this is led by Sea Level Construction with their subconsultants Specs, Rodriguez Electric Service, Pat Grabert Plumbing, B2 Refrigeration, DACP Construction. All of the construction contractors are Louisiana-based businesses. This is a total of 216 jobs, both on the engineering, design, construction, administration, and construction part of this, not including government workers. Last month, CPRA signed a project partnership agreement with the Corps of Engineers for the $6.5 billion Southwest Coastal Louisiana Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction and Coastal Ecosystem Restoration Project. You can see in a couple of the pictures, Major General Holland, Colonel Jones, and Chairman Hawes. This project was authorized in the Water Infrastructure Improvement for the Nation Act of 2016. Congress and the administration made a national commitment by including $286 million of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law and an additional $10 million in the 2022 community project funding to initiate construction of non-structural flood risk management plan. The funds will be used to elevate an estimated 800 to 1,000 of the overall 3,462 structures identified in the feasibility report. 27 structures have cleared all assessments and are ready to be raised, with 17 in Vermilion Parish and 10 in Calcasieu Parish. The Corps of Engineers, in partnership with CPRA, will host public meetings in late summer of this year where homeowners can get more information on the project and begin registering for the elevation project. Structure elevations are scheduled to begin in June of 2024. And I'll note Major General Holland in that picture. Today is transfer of command for the Vicksburg division up in Vicksburg. So today's the last day for Major General Holland. We want to thank her and appreciate all of her work, and we look forward to welcoming Brigadier General Kimberly Peoples to that job and hopefully seeing her down in Louisiana, and look forward to continuing the great collaboration with the Corps of Engineers. Last month, CPRA was excited to join Terrebonne Parish for their Coastal Day program. This annual event is free and open to the public and serves as an interactive showcase of Terrebonne Parish's flood risk reduction and coastal restoration projects. It provides residents and other visitors a venue to learn more about the flood risk reduction methods and structures in place, such as floodgates, levees, lock systems, and pump stations. We always appreciate the opportunity to engage with the public and other stakeholders and to educate them more about the important work taking place in their community. This also happened to be Chip Klein's last speaking engagement as CPRA chairman, and he was awarded the key to the parish and several other honors. I believe those locks have been changed since that point in time. Last month, we also had a visit from Deputy Secretary Don Graves. He's the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce. He visited Louisiana, and the focus of the visit was to highlight some of the bipartisan infrastructure awards that came to Louisiana, including a couple of awards for work in the central wetlands, and also another work to the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana's oyster shell recycling program, and that program award is in partnership with RAE, Restore America's Estuaries. You can see the folks with CRCL down at their Violet Yard. Deputy Secretary Graves rolled up his sleeves and they put them to work bagging some oyster shells down that way on a pretty hot day last month. In the bottom left corner, Deputy Graves also attended a roundtable at Nunez Community College centered around H to the Future, another Build Back Better regional challenge grant that Louisiana is working on. And we definitely appreciate Deputy Graves' visit and hopes that he comes back down later this year when we put those oyster shells out for one of the CRCL projects down in Point of Shin. All right, so always good to get a surprise on your first board meeting. So just a couple of weeks ago, CPRA joined the folks with CRCL and other partners at Goose Point Marsh Restoration to do some great volunteer work with funding through Restore America's Estuaries, Citco, and Next Era. CRCL was able to get 100,000 pounds of recycled glass used to create 400 feet of sediment fencing to protect from future damage. 8,000 southern bulrush grass plants were planted. So huge thank you to all the volunteers and coastal partners who dedicated their time on this project to do some great work up at the Big Branch. So with that said, I'll be glad to take any questions, Mr. Chairman or members of the board.
Thank you, Greg, for that update and what I imagine is a welcome change of pace from the individual that was previously giving the implementations updates for the last couple of years. And we do appreciate the theme music. So any questions for Mr. Grandy from the board? Seeing no questions, I would just add, Greg, that you and I had an opportunity to join CRCL just Sunday to do a planting in Violet, Louisiana. It was a great experience. I would just encourage anybody that gets an opportunity to volunteer and do one of those to take advantage of it. We met some folks that we don't typically get to meet and do some good for our coast and get our hands muddy. So it was nice. All right. Yeah.
Very good. And if I could take just a moment of personal privilege, since there aren't any questions, I'd like to invite one of our staff members, Mr. VJ Moretta, to join me up at the desk. VJ is 31 plus years he's worked for the state of Louisiana, and the majority of those years with CPRA or the Department of Natural Resources doing land rights for coastal restoration. Have a seat right here, VJ. We don't present a lot to this board about our land rights. It's kind of like a kicker on a football team. You only notice them if they miss. So, but every project we build requires four things. It requires plans and specifications, permits, funding, and land rights. And as our land rights folks remind us continually, if you don't have land rights, you don't have a project. And we've had many projects over the years that have progressed and received those other pieces, but haven't had land rights, and we haven't been able to move forward with them. Some of our projects, and I showed we have 141 active projects right now. Some of our projects have one or two landowners. Some, as VJ knows, may have 3, 4, maybe 1,000 landowners on a project. And over the years, VJ's been responsible for thousands of those land rights agreements and dozens of them going to construction. A colleague of mine had lunch with VJ earlier this week, and we asked him, was there any project of yours that's very memorable that stands out? And we're very fortunate. We actually have a photograph of that particular instance. And what you're seeing in this photograph is a project manager who failed to tell his landman to bring boots because he was going to have to jump out of the boat. And then he had to carry him from the boat to the project. This is around 2003 down in Lower Plaquemines Parish on a project, Pass Chalon to Grand Bayou Pass. We built around 2007, 16 years later. It's doing great. VJ, your legacy continues all across the coast of Louisiana. And I know your colleagues and myself will miss you, and your work will live on. And we're going to continue building projects you've worked on for many years. I would like to read this proclamation to you real quick, an official statement. In the name and by the authority of the state of Louisiana, I, John Bell Edwards, together with the citizens of the state, do hereby give special recognition to V.J. Moretta and acknowledgement of his 31-plus years of unyielding leadership and dedicated service with the state of Louisiana. Please join me in thanking V.J. Moretta.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, VJ. I just note that VJ still has his life jacket on, which maybe is an indication of the level of confidence he has in you getting him to the island dry. But appreciate your service, VJ. You'll be missed, and I know Greg and I have both worked with VJ virtually our entire careers. And Greg's sentiment about sort of the behind-the-scenes work that goes on to make this train run and certainly run on time. VJ is one of the key cogs in that wheel. So. One of many, so appreciate that. All right, we'll move on to agenda item number 7, bird colony restoration in Louisiana and their international importance. Todd Baker, Casey Wright, and Barrett Fortier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Todd Baker. I'm a project manager with CPRA. I'm joined by Casey Wright, our coastal resource scientist supervisor with CPRA, and longtime colleague Barrett Fortier with the Fish and Wildlife Service, senior wildlife biologist. And we're going to give you basically an update of some bird colony restoration we've done lately in Louisiana, and then Casey's going to take it from there and talk about their international importance. So before we get started, it's important to define what a colony is. A bird colony, particularly a brown pelican colony in Louisiana, are generally very small islands associated with barrier island chains or just remote small marsh islands that for most of the year don't have much on them as far as birds are concerned. But every spring and every summer, high densities and numbers and species, high species diversity is assembled on these small tiny islands that are predator free to raise young, to nest and raise young. These birds are called colonial water birds. There's many different species, and we're going to focus on brown pelicans today, but you're going to hear us use terms like wading birds, terns, and skimmers, and so I'll kind of define what those are. Wading birds are generally birds with long legs, like the roseate spoonbill in the top right, and egrets and herons in the top left. But there's also colonial water birds that depend on bare ground or bare sand type areas to nest, and those are terns and skimmers. And the bottom left is an example of royal terns that nest throughout Louisiana, and the bottom right are black skimmers. So when we talk about colonies, we're talking about these assemblages of birds that nest in very high densities on these tiny little remote islands. And again, we're going to focus primarily on brown pelicans, and so when we do that, I always like to start by talking about how our brown pelican colonies in Louisiana are in steep decline. 2002, we had 30 brown pelican colonies in Louisiana. By 2010, we were down to 22. And as we stand here today, there's only 9 left in Louisiana. And of those 9, 3 have been recently restored and 3 are under design. We're going to talk to you today about the 3 that have been recently restored. That's Queen Bess, Rabbit Island, and North Breton Island. And I actually skipped a little bit. One thing I do want to recognize Wildlife and Fisheries on this. They've been with us every step of the way through engineering, design, construction, and monitoring as well. So we'll start off talking about Queen Bess Island. Queen Bess Island is photographed here. This is pre-construction in 2018. That rock perimeter around it is about 37 acres in size, but you can see the habitat within it is quite small. This island is in Barataria Bay, just about 2.5 miles north of Grand Isle. The nesting habitat that was left in 2018 was about 5 or 6 acres for brown pelicans. A lot of that marsh you see in there is really tidal, so those birds won't nest in it. They were nesting on those little fingers and ridges throughout the island. And this is what nesting looked like for a brown pelican on Queen Bess Island prior to restoration. You can see they're basically on every branch, every little bush that stuck out of the water, they were on it. And a lot of times there would be 2 to 3 nests per bush. So much like our coastal communities, these guys are losing their habitat and then clinging to ever smaller pieces of real estate to call home. Fortunately, we received some funding from the Louisiana TIG back in 2019 to restore Queen Bess Island before that colony reached the point of collapse. The funds we received were from Louisiana TIG. Those were the bird funds from those were NERDA funds, Natural Resource Damage Assessment funds from the bird pot of funds set aside specifically to restore birds. So we went out to Queen Bess Island. There's a few of the project features on the slide in front of you, but essentially what we did was we enhanced the existing rock ring around the island, pumped in 150,000 cubic yards of sand from the Mississippi River that brought the elevation of the island from about a 1.5 up to 4 foot. So that gave them the elevation and relief from tidal waters. Topped a small area of the island with limestone to create a low maintenance bare ground habitat for those ground nesting birds like terns and skimmers. And then finally we planted it with 26,000 shrubs. And this is what the project looked like after restoration. So quite a stark difference from being mainly open water to now mainly sand immediately after construction. And this is what it looks like today. So it looks a whole lot better than it did in 18 and even better than it did in 2020. So when we received the funds, we had goals for restoring habitat. And certainly we had acres in mind and different things that we wanted to do within those acres. But the goal for this project and all of our colony projects have never really been about the acres, but they've been about the number of nests. This money was set aside to restore for birds, and so we had to produce birds. And so what I have in front of you is a slide showing what the bird numbers were in 2018 on Queen Bess. Those wading birds, again, that's egrets and herons, terns, and skimmers. You can see the numbers below. But before the TIG would provide funding to us, we had to give them our expectations for what success would look like. They wanted to know, what is the project going to build? So in knowing that we were going to go out there and bury most of the habitat, we knew that expectations in year 1 should be much different from when the habitat would be mature 10, 12 years later. So we gave them a year 1 set of expectations and then a year 10 set of expectations. So I'll explain. So in 2018, you can see the numbers prior to restoration. And then after restoration, we expected 0 wading birds. Well, there's a good reason for that. We took a lot of that habitat that was out there and buried it with sand, and sand is not suitable habitat for wading bird nesting. So we expected those bird numbers to tank for wading birds. Terns and skimmers, because we were providing new sand, we expected those numbers to make a big jump in year 1. Laughing gulls, because we buried a lot of the marsh grass, we expected those numbers to decline. And again, brown pelicans, because we were burying much of the woody substrate and vegetation out there, we expected those numbers to decline in year 1. And this is the results from our year 1 survey. You can see we exceeded our expectations from year 1 quite strongly. Wading birds, they didn't quite zero out, but they did take a pretty good decline as we expected. Terns and skimmers, they made a big jump, a much bigger jump than we expected. Laughing gulls, they even climbed, even though we expected a decline in those. And brown pelicans did go down, but only by about half. So year 1, we were looking pretty good. And these are actually not year 1 results. This is 2021 is immediately, no, I'm sorry, this is year 1. Year 1 results. I'm getting confused with another project. So year 1, right out of the gate, we're looking pretty good. We have expectations beat. And you can see these are year 10 expectations, what we expect 10 years down the road after construction. And we're well on our way to meeting that goal with wading birds. Terns and skimmers, we've exceeded it. Laughing gulls, we've exceeded it. Brown pelicans, we're getting very close. So things are looking good. But the one thing I want to point out, when you look at Queen Bess 2018, obviously pre-construction, and then what it looks like today, take a look at the habitat. You don't see much open water in that 2023 project. So what's happening is that sand that we put out there and those plants that we put in the ground are starting to mature over time. So that habitat is getting much more prevalent and doing pretty good shape. And even though I don't have survey results, we have not flown those survey results for the last year. I can tell you that it is my opinion that we have exceeded year 10 expectations as of this year. This is a photograph of Queen Bess Island from a month ago. And we had 3 different cells that we restored. We expected brown pelicans to be in 2 cells, and they're all in all 3 cells at this point. Another thing I want to point out about this picture is notice that they're not all ganged up on every single branch, every little clump of grass. They're more evenly dispersed throughout the habitat. That's a really good sign that these guys have plenty of room to spread out, and they're not just clinging to marginal habitat. So these guys have a good habitat moving forward, and we expect those numbers to continue to climb. And I look forward to future monitoring. So things are looking good at Queen Bess, and I believe we have exceeded our year 10 expectations in just year 3. So the next project we'll talk about is Rabbit Island. This is our only brown pelican colony, going the wrong way, in southwest Louisiana. It's about 200 acres in size. Prior to restoration, the average elevation of this island was 1 foot. And you'll see with that last bullet, the mean high tide of the lake is 1 foot. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out what would happen frequently out here. One thing before I go to the next slide, if you see those little, in the center of your screen, you see those little dots, those white dots and tan spots. That's where the birds are congregated onto the only elevation on the island that's about 1.5 feet tall. So unfortunately, this was the scene at Rabbit Island almost every year prior to restoration. Brown pelicans traditionally come back to the same islands over and over and over until it's no longer there. And so these guys are trying to make use of the highest elevations on the island, but unfortunately in most years it was not enough. Talking to some of my colleagues at ULL, they were surprised that brown pelicans were even continuing to nest at Rabbit Island because of the frequency of inundation out there. Nest success was less than 50%, which is a formula for colony abandonment. So fortunately, we were able to receive restoration funds before they abandoned Rabbit Island in southwest Louisiana. Again, the funds were the same as Queen Bess that came from the Louisiana TIG out of the NERDA pot of funds specifically set aside for birds. This project involved pumping 600,000 cubic yards of sediment out of the Calcasieu River ship channel. We pumped it into 3 different cells on Rabbit Island. The northernmost island or cell was cell 1. We pumped that from an elevation that was 1 and below 1 up to 3. Cell 2 is on the west side. That was elevated to 3.5 foot, and then we did a marsh nourishment on the south side. This is just a few photographs of that project under construction, a traditional construction project where we had build containment levees and pump in a slurry of material from the river channel until we get the proper elevation, and then we plant the island. And this is it in 2021, immediately post-construction, south looking north, and this is perhaps a better shot at it. This is north looking south. You can see the expanse of the island that was pumped up. But again, like I was saying earlier, we can talk about the acres all day long, and that's great, and we do need more nesting habitat acres in Louisiana, but this project has always been about the number of nests. That was the goal. We needed to increase birds. And one thing, I'm going to take a slight aside and explain a couple things to you. When you see this year 1 expectations in front of you, and the next slide you'll see a year 10 expectations, you'll notice that those numbers are considerably low. When we applied for the funding for this project, we weren't flying these surveys as we currently do. They were the surveys that were put together, and the only data we had available to us at the time were biologists going out there and just making an estimate of the number of birds out there. And we learned after we flew the first colonial water bird survey, which is a very high definition, very accurate count, that our numbers were very low. So our expectations were built on the best data set we had, but was not the best data we could have gotten. So when you see those year 1 and later year 10 expectations, know that we recognize that those are really low. But I put them up here just because you'll kind of see the trend. 2018 numbers, again, those are pre-construction numbers. Louisiana TIG wanted to know what success would look like if we received the funding, so year 1 expectations follow the same trend. Again, we expected wading birds to really tank. Terns and skimmers, we didn't know there were 500 nests out there. We thought it was more like in the order of dozens, so we did expect those to rise. Laughing gulls, because we were burying most of the marsh, we expected those to decline. and brown pelicans, we expected a decline as well. And so this 2021 survey is actually year 0. This is the island has not had a full growing season yet, and you can see the response. Wading birds did decline as we expected. Terns and skimmers exploded a little more than we expected. Laughing gulls, they did just fine, and brown pelicans took a dip, and those trends were expected in year 0. But this past year, we just got our year 1 expectation, or year 1 results, and you can see with the numbers of 32,000, we more than doubled the nesting population out there from pre-construction, which is pretty amazing. No one saw this coming. And I'll go ahead and show you year 10 expectations. Those are artificially low due to a survey technique, but it shows you at Rabbit Island, when you have the only brown pelican colony in that corner of the state, the numbers simply exploded. So yeah, our expectations were, are off the chart, more than doubled in year 1 from what they were pre-construction. And so this is what success looks like on those 2 projects. The money was set aside to restore for birds, and we have lots of chicks today running around on both of those islands, so things are looking really good. One thing, a little word of caution I will point out is that when you see success like that, it's certainly something we're celebrating and noting and being very proud of. But it's also a little bit alarming. It shows you how much in decline and how much that habitat is missing across our coastal landscapes. You build it, and before it's even mature, they're flocking to it in extraordinary numbers. So what we have shown is that in Louisiana, we can absolutely do good colony restoration work, and the birds are telling us that there's a big need for it out there. And then this is just a photograph from late May of Rabbit Island. Again, kind of looks similar to Queen Bess, that those birds are more evenly dispersed. In that first shot where I was pointing out those little white dots and tan areas where they clustered on those highest elevations that are left, these birds, again, are more evenly dispersed over the island. So that's a really good sign. Those birds enjoy most of what we built out there and are using it to its fullest extent. And so that's all I have on Queen Bess and Rabbit Island, and I'll turn it over to Barrett for North Breton.
Good morning, Barrett, Forte Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank y'all for having me this morning. Before I get going, I'd like to commend CPRA for hiring biologist types to be involved in these projects. No offense, Katie. But it's a big help. I mean, I had a working history with both of these folks when they were with LDWF, and Todd and I have known each other a long time. And it's a big help on these projects to have a biologist mind involved from the CPRA side. I am based in Lacombe, Southeast Louisiana Refuge Complex, Breton being one of 9 refuges that we oversee there. The picture here on the left, I wanted to depict June 2010. We all know what was going on there. It may be a little bit hard to tell, but that is North Breton encapsulated by oil boom. Most of it hard, basic orange hard boom, and then some of the bigger navy boom that was utilized during the spill. So we did have impacts to North Breton, and furthermore had some storm activity come through and actually washed some boom up on the island. So that presents a whole nother problem. And then the picture to the right is pre-construction. You can see the footprint is not overly impressive compared historically to what North Breton was. And just kind of keep those 2 images in your mind as we move along. Project features, we expanded the island from about 290 to roughly 426 acres, so a pretty good jump. We pumped almost 6 million cubic yards of material onto the island platform. Our dredge source was about 3 miles east of North Breton proper. Installed 15,000 linear feet of sand fencing. Our plantings are ongoing right now. We're going to plant 64 acres of the dune system. We're about 80% done. We started this spring on that. Would have been complete, had a couple freak weather events came through, 35 knot winds, and buried a bunch of the plants right along the sand fence itself. So when we go back this fall, we've got some additional funding we've modified, and we'll make up for that loss there. This fall also, we're going to plant 53 acres of black mangrove, which the North Breton project, what makes it a little bit unique is that timing worked out. We were able to couple it with the Amaretta Hess settlement. So out of that Amaretta Hess settlement, we actually added 53 acres onto the project. So that worked out good for all parties involved, and hopefully we can get those mangrove established and create the ideas to create almost double our brown pelican nesting habitat there. Also, we'll have 165 acres of smooth cordgrass planted on the back barrier marsh side. We're basically waiting on hit target elevation there. We're about halfway there with half of that acreage. But we'll do that in 2 stages. We were going to have to do that anyway because we're looking at like 800,000 Spartina plugs to go in the ground. So that would be in 2 stages regardless. This is a shot from February 2022. Post-construction, obviously, it's a drastic difference to what the platform looked like just a couple years prior to. If you notice out on the northeast corner there, that kind of white sandy portion there, we figured when Ida came through, our best calculations, we lost about 100,000 cubic yards of dredge material. So we modified the contract too, and we added an additional 100,000 cubic yards to that northeast corner, where, dealing with engineers, we figured we'd get decent transport out of that location. So maybe keep the sand in the system out on that northeast side. This is just a shot of our spring plantings. This was, they're small at this point. This was actually our final inspection. I've been out a couple times since. They've probably grown foot and a half. Look really good, vibrant. Plantings are doing well. This is a shot actually Todd took as they were passing by. It's hard to pick out, but there's you can see the rows of plants. In every row of plants, there's thousands of terns nesting, staged up, nesting inside the rows of plants. So the terns have kind of taken a liking to the south end of the island. And then last time I was out, there's actually a bunch of black skimmers on the Gulf side of the dune, thousands of black skimmers nesting. So they've taken to it pretty well. So along the same lines, Todd covered, these are all Calibre flight numbers. It's really beneficial to us as a resource agency to have a finite shot in time with high resolution. They can go in and they're dotting those nests. We know exactly what birds are using the island and how many nests we have. We'll go out and ground truth that a couple surveys a year anyway, but that view from the sky is priceless for us. And that goes for all of these islands that they're actually surveying. So wading birds, North Breton's never been a real big wading bird rookery. Terns and skimmers, 18,000 roughly nest. Brown pelicans were close to 6,500. Laughing gulls, 3. So we jump fast forward to 2021. Actually had a wading bird nest. So the terns and skimmers declined drastically, which we fully suspected. A lot of disturbance. Those colonial nesters don't do well with a lot of disturbance. Laughing gulls, the numbers went up. I have no scientific data, but I suspect they were snatching bologna sandwiches while the contractors were there. And in brown pelicans, we had a decline, about 30% decline, which was it was anticipated, but I was pleased that it wasn't any lower than that. So I think what we have, same issue at North Breton. Todd talked about at Queen Bess. Every stitch of mangrove is occupied. Real estate is at a premium. So what we have is birds overflow. So some of the birds nesting in the grass, higher elevations, they do fine. Lower elevation grass, they generally get flooded out. So what happened was we lost a lot of that overflow grassy area due to construction. So we had sand on top of that, dozer activity there. So we had a not substantial decline, but not as bad as we thought it was going to be. Another factor we learned too, and we were upfront with the contractor going in. So from Station 40 north, Station 40 was just south of the mangrove area. We kept them out of Station 40 north from April 1 through mid-August. So they knew they had to get all their work done that they could before April 1. And then we peeled them back and they started working south. So that cut down on disturbance, and we had a really successful nesting season for brown pelicans. Then we jumped to 2022. Terns and skimmers are coming back. I was a little bit disappointed early last year. We didn't have a lot of birds showing up, but then by July we had a lot of terns and skimmers showing up. We suspect, and I think Todd witnessed some of this too, in 2021, we suspect a lot of those birds ended up at Gun Island, just out of Baptiste Colette. So hopefully we've got some of those birds coming back. Laughing gulls, the numbers went down. I'm clueless on that one right now. Bologna was gone, right? No more Vienna sausage, I don't know. Brown pelicans, our numbers jumped back up. We're not far off from where we were in 18. I did a May survey, ground survey, and even in early May, we were already back up to like 5,600 nests. So I'm interested to see most of the nests, they focus on the mangrove area, and then as the late bloomers come in, if you will, they're pushing out to the grass. So I suspect when we see colibri numbers, that number will be well above 5,600. We'll probably be closer back to where we were in 18, maybe more. And then also about 6,000 terns and skimmers were staged and engaging in courtship behavior, even in May. One side note, we did have a couple of mottle duck nests on the island last year, which is pretty neat when you think about how far out Breton is, and we actually had a couple mottle ducks nest in there. I'll pass it on to Casey Wright. Casey will kind of talk about the not only regional, statewide, but national and international importance of some of these islands. Thank y'all.
All right, for my part, is this working?
You have to lean into it.
Okay. For my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on brown pelicans, but I think it's important to note the importance of our colonies for coastal breeding bird populations. We rank number 1 in 6 different species of colonial birds, including sandwich tern. We hold 83% of the northern Gulf of Mexico population. Additionally, we hold 70% of the global population of sandwich terns. Brown pelicans, 47% of the northern Gulf of Mexico population resides or breeds in Louisiana. And that is also 23% of the global population. And then we've also ranked number 1 for Forster's tern, royal tern, black skimmer, and tricolored heron. And this really shows, how important it is to continue to restore our colonies to make sure we're maintaining and growing the population of coastal avifauna in Louisiana. So I'm going to give a background on brown pelicans. They take approximately 4 years to reach sexual maturity. They express a high degree of site fidelity to their natal colony, which means that they return to the island that they hatched at after they've become sexually mature. And so little was known about how substantial habitat changes associated with large-scale restoration would alter the future use of those colonies, and that's why we started a brown pelican banding project at Queen Bess and Rabbit Island. So this shows the process. We put alphanumeric color bands on the left leg of these brown pelicans, and we put a USGS federal band on the right. And you can see by this, you can see from a distance the numbering on the color band. You're not going to be able to recite, just by the metal band unless you've got a really big camera and lots of time to take pictures all the way around the band and get all the numbers. So that leads to higher recite numbers, higher returns. So we also take measurements, bill and wing measurements on these birds as well before releasing. And of note, the first 2 years, 2019 and 2020, we also banded flightless chicks on the island. And then the picture of all of us is from this year's banding effort. And so for the results, we banded a total of 1,150 pelicans on Queen Bess through between 2019 and 2022. This year, we banded an additional 227. Rabbit Island, we banded 322 between 2020 and 2021. And we received 242 resites through the years of the pelicans that we have banded. And that constitutes 169 individual birds that were resited across the Gulf of Mexico and internationally. 30% of the adult brown pelicans have been resited nesting on Queen Bess, so that goes back to our original research question as to if they would come back after we build it, and I think, these results suggest that is the case, that they do return. And a caveat to 30%, it may sound like that's a low return rate, but with how densely these birds are packed on the colony, it's incredibly difficult to see the leg bands once they're nesting. And so the bird on the right is actually banded, but you can't see the legs unless they stand up on the nest like the one on the left. So this is the northern Gulf of Mexico resightings. The orange lines are birds banded at Queen Bess, and the purple is birds banded at Rabbit. And you can see that we had resites from the Florida Keys all the way to the southern tip of Texas. And of these birds, like juveniles that were resited outside of Louisiana, 75% of them were juveniles. This kind of leads into the fact that they do take at least 4 years to sexually mature. So they're able to branch out from Louisiana and get to areas in the wintertime that have healthier fish populations. If they all stayed in Louisiana, there wouldn't be enough food in the wintertime, because the fish that they feed on go into the surface fish that they feed on go into deeper waters, and so that makes the food availability lower. So they're able to leave for 3-4 years before coming back. So our pelicans don't just hold national importance. I mentioned earlier that Louisiana holds 23% of the global populations, or the global nesting populations for brown pelicans. And while they are site fidelic, while they do come back to their natal colony, there is dispersal to other areas. In the last couple of years, we've had 5 adults that were resited in Mexico, and we're not sure if they just fled for Hurricane Ida or if they're relocating and going to breed there. So these are our foreign resites. We had 29 resites internationally from Mexico, Panama, Guatemala, Belize, and Cuba. Our furthest migrant was the Panama bird, which was 1,535 miles from Queen Bess. The Cuba bird was a little over 1,000 miles from Rabbit Island. And then this is just a graphic showing like all the resightings. So, like I said earlier, there's 242 resightings since 2019, and that constitutes 169. Yeah, 169 birds. And so I'm going to talk about like individual birds as like an example for average dispersal or typical dispersal patterns. So this one, you can't really see the band as well, it's kind of dark, but this is BT1. It shows a typical dispersal pattern for an adult brown pelican. It was banded on Queen Bess as an adult, so meaning it was at least 4 years old. in 2019. In the winter of 2020 and 21, it was seen on both Elmer's Island and Grand Isle, which is close to Queen Bess. And then that breeding season, it was back, confirmed breeding on Queen Bess. Another example that I didn't get a chance to put the slide in, we had in 2021, I recited a bird that was impacted by the BP oil spill. This particular bird was captured and it was transported to a rehab facility in state. But then because it was 2010, we didn't want, and they come back. They have, they always come back to Queen Bess. So we flew it to the east coast of Georgia and released it. And it was seen, I talked to the bander, it was seen several times through the years, up until 2015, I think, around Georgia, Florida area. In 2021, I saw that bird on Queen Bess. So it made its way back, and was presumed to be breeding. And it's a 700-mile journey from Brunswick, Georgia to back to Queen Bess. And so then we've got AK8, which was banded as an adult in 2019. This is a mostly typical, but kind of atypical. It was banded on Queen Bess as an adult. I saw it again in 2021 on Queen Bess. And then this year, March 2023, it was resighted in the Florida Keys. And it was just resighted last week on Queen Bess. So I suspect I've seen several, and I didn't put this in the spreadsheet or in the slideshow, but we've had several adults that have left Louisiana, which is atypical, but it's been since 2021. So I suspect that it's due to birds fleeing from Hurricane Ida. But this one came back this year. This is a typical, migratory pattern for juvenile birds. This bird was banded in Queen Bess as a flightless chick in 2019. In 2020, it was resighted in Mexico, and then 2021, it was back. It was in Mississippi, and so we haven't received any more resights of this bird, but it should presumably be making its way back. And so this is information from North Breton Island. So they've seen similar patterns over the past 3 years there. These were all flightless chicks that were banded, but they've had resightings in Mexico, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And then does anybody have any questions?
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Wright, Mr. Forche, Mr. Baker. Appreciate that. As a biologist type myself, I think to use Mr. Forche's comment, appreciate your comment. It does take all disciplines, of course, to make these things happen. But very interesting, and I'd ask the board if they have any questions for the speakers. Ms. Goodson.
So thank you so much. It's fascinating, everything that y'all presented today. I am a big proponent of National Geographic TV. I watch it every weekend on the zoos, behind the zoos and all. And to me, this would be a story that they would be interested in presenting, because it's about the habits of the birds coming back home and just what y'all have learned. And I would encourage you to reach out to them. I think we need to reach out to them, because I watch those shows over and over again. I just think they're so fascinating, and it really helps our generations and our children to be able to learn what y'all are doing. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Ms. Goodson. I can tell you that we have indeed done that, actually, quite recently. And so while I can't say too much about it at this point in time. You'll see something, I think, related to a National Geographic production within the next year or so. Let's see, Mr. Bourgeois. Hold on a second. There we go.
Okay, good. I have a quick question from some of the conversation we had, and I kind of going to take it back to the engineering side of it. But my question is basically, great work, great results, and I'm under no illusion that disillusion that it's easier to get money to do reactive things than it is proactive things. But my question would be, given the propensity of most of these birds to return to their home nesting site, if we happen to find an island somewhere that's not currently being used as a colony, but is, from an engineering perspective, one of the easiest things for us to restore, it happens to be at the right place, and we could build it up and do and get it above sea level at a reasonable price. Is it a build it and they will come kind of thing? You demonstrated that they certainly don't have enough room. So I don't know, but all of you touched on it. It was just a thought.
No, it's a great question, and we get that quite often. There's several islands out here. Why aren't they using any one of these? And to be quite honest with you, we don't have the answer to that question. I mean, you're dealing with birds and bird brains, and we got to get them to like what they're at. I can tell you there are islands throughout coastal Louisiana that we have thought that those birds would ideally use, and we've done relocation techniques, which is how we got brown pelicans reestablished in Louisiana. We've taken chicks off of nearby islands, put them on new islands, raised them there, and the thought process they would come back because, in our opinion, this is a much better island. And it works about 50% of the time.
They don't hold our opinions.
They don't. Yeah, what they see is not what we see. So
all right.
That's kind of why we took the tack with some of these funds that we did. We know we have islands that are failing. We know they like that island, so we invest in those islands.
That's why we need the biologist and not the engineer on this particular case. Thank you.
Mr. Bourgeois, I'll add to that point. We had talked about Gun Island, so you've got all these little islands coming out of Baptiste Colette and core dredge spoil. And what we'll find is you've got really good activity for about the first 3 or 4 years. Terns, kind of colonial nester birds, ground nesting, right? And then once the vegetation comes up, they're out, and we haven't really seen brown pelicans move into that habitat. So, yeah, it's a toss-up. But I think there's plenty opportunity for some of those islands, especially out like Biloxi Marsh area, stuff like that, where we historically had some brown pelican colonies.
Gotcha. Thanks, guys.
Mr. Garrett.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and apologies to Mr. Fauché and yourself. I'd like to admonish CPRA for hiring these biologists, my former colleagues. But no, I think, Todd, you gave some recognition to LDWF, who was the lead trustee on these bird projects, and particularly yourself when you were with LDWF. And I consider you to be kind of the architect and the driving force behind Queen Bess and Rabbit Island. And I think the recognition needs to be made not only for LDWF, but for you personally. These are unquestionably and immensely successful projects, and largely due to your efforts. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett, but I will point out it is a team effort, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I would reiterate Todd's comment earlier, and our thanks not just to the Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but obviously the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Many of these projects occur on Wildlife and Fisheries property. The expertise of the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries has certainly gone into developing, planning, and implementing these projects. So thank you, Mr. Garrett, for that. Ms. Gautreaux.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation. I have a question about incorporating other restoration with when you do these island or shoreline restorations. Do you ever consider, say, doing oyster reefs as the barrier to have an opportunity for additional restoration?
So recently we had a project. Unfortunately, it didn't make it to construction, but Isle of Pete was one that was under design, and they were putting a significant oyster component to it. It's something that we have been entertaining lately, looking into, and probably could do more of that moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Another thing, I had a quick question. I see a lot of these volunteers are familiar faces in the banding? Do you have to do special training before letting some people loose and band pelicans?
I'll forward that question over to Mr. Garrett. Usually, Wildlife and Fisheries will take volunteers that want to do this kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
There has to be someone out there that is federally licensed to ban the birds.
It's good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gotro. Any other questions from the board? I had one additional question, I guess, and maybe Todd, this might be for you. I guess you had mentioned that obviously we've done work on the 3 colonies that we presented here today. Could you just touch on the other 3 and kind of where we are and the plans for those?
Yeah, I meant to do that. I missed it. Thank you. The other 3 islands that are currently under engineering design are Raccoon Island in Terrebonne Parish. It's undergoing engineering design. It's funded by the Louisiana TIG. HNC Island, which is also in Terrebonne Parish, right outside of Cocodrie, it's under engineering design as well. I'm not real familiar on exactly where those 2 sit. The other one is New Harbor Island, which is part of the Chandler Island chain and being developed as part of the Chandler Island Restoration Project. And that we're undergoing data collection on that right now. So all 3 of those projects are moving forward, looking promising.
Great. Thank you. And Again, I would reiterate just how, we all for years have talked about why this isn't just a Louisiana problem, right? The challenges we face in coastal Louisiana are not just Louisiana's problem, not just coastal Louisiana's problem, it's the entire state, the entire nation. And as evidenced by the presentation today, indeed, it's an international issue when you consider waterfowl and other wildlife that might breed in the Arctic or in Canada, spend some time here and overwinter in Central or South America. It becomes all that more evident that this is indeed a national and international problem, which we all should be discussing with all of our friends all over the world, right? So here's some evidence to help you do that. Last thing I'll say, and I thought it was quite poignant, what you mentioned, Todd, when you showed the picture of the pelicans clinging to kind of the last bits of what was Queen Bess. We talk a lot about birds, we talk a lot about wildlife in our ecosystem, but we're all in this together, right? We are a part of this ecosystem, and much as the birds are clinging to the remains of some of the ecosystem here in coastal Louisiana, and we're making an effort to restore that. We're also making an effort to restore that for the people of Louisiana and to protect the people and communities of Louisiana from the same impacts, quite frankly, that our wildlife and our ecosystem are facing. So I thought that was just a really good point and a good connection there, Todd. So if there are no other questions, we'll move on in the agenda. Thank you all very much for your presentation. We'll move on to agenda item number 8, Restoration Partnerships. Mr. Kent Balfrass.
All right, good morning, everybody. I have a brief update for you today on the Partnership Fund. No frills. It's going to be relatively quick. My presentations are normally quick, but this time I don't even have a project spotlight per se. But the update this time around is that we're happy to announce the FY24 Partnership Fund request for proposals. So that's open as of today, and it'll be open for the next 3 months. I'll get into that a little bit more here in a sec. So, as a reminder of the history of the Partnership Fund and what it is, what it does, and kind of what it's done in the past, this is a reimbursement grant program where our prospective partners come to us with their project ideas and request additional funding. And it's either the funding that gets them from, so let's say, 50% to 100%, and they can put it on the ground, or it's money that they can take, they already have for 100%, and maybe make it 150 or 200%, make it a little bit bigger. So those are the types of things we're trying to do. This is state surplus funding, and over, let's see, I guess 15 years now, since 2008, we have partnered with 43 partner projects. These are NGOs, private entities, landowners, and some of our parish partners as well. In those 15 years, we've contributed over $12 million, and our partners have brought $17 million to the table, and that's nearly $30 million of on-the-ground restoration. I will point out, even though I don't have any frills in my presentation, that picture is from the Goose Point project that Mr. Grandy presented on, and it had that awesome music. So we did get some frills earlier, and that's kind of tying the implementation update with what this program is. Putting the two together, so that these are meaningful on the ground projects for our partners, for our parishes, for our regions, stakeholders, all that stuff. So this year, we're again, this is the announcement for the RFP. We're happy to announce that we have another $1 million to contribute to our partners' projects. So start thinking your ideas and get ready to submit. And really, what this does is it allows us to use some of our funding to leverage those funds to increase our capacity to reach our goals and objectives. And I say it's us reaching those, but it's also our partners. Our partners get to leverage their funding, whether it's their own capital funds or third-party grants, to get their projects on the ground. Here's a little depiction of the general timeline that we got. I have specific dates within the RFP, so I'm announcing it today. It's open as of today. It'll be open for the next 3 months through October. After the October deadline, a team of scientists, engineers, biologist types will be evaluating the proposals, and we consider primarily the 5 considerations that are listed there in the lower blue box. So then we start notifying our partners, kind of working through what those agreements might look like, and start the contractual administration and all that kind of stuff, and then we move into implementation in out years. So that's the general timeline. Again, I've got specific dates in the RFP, so be on the lookout for that. So where you can find it, it's going to be posted on the website. It's going to be on our socials, our social media pages. I also have hard copies with me, so come see me today during the meeting, after the meeting. I'll put them on the table outside as well as I leave, so you can grab that. You'll have all the information you need. But then also, you can contact me and my team at partnershipfund@la.gov with any questions. We can get you the RFP. We can spitball project concepts with you. We can kind of answer any questions you might have about the program and all that sort of stuff. So please reach out. We're very open and very willing to help out where we can. So that's the partnership fund, and I don't want anybody to confuse what I'm about to tease next with that program, but we do have a second part of a presentation here, and this is sort of more of a notification. This is not an announcement that we're opening another program at this time, but it's to be aware that there will be another program coming in the near future, and that's the fiscal year 24 parish matching program. Again, this is separate from what I just presented on Partnership Fund. That Partnership Fund is open as of today, but this is going to be a separate pot of money for a separate purpose altogether. This represents CPRA's first effort to replace some of the Restore money that was shifted over from parish matching to the Maurepas Freshwater Reintroduction Project last year, if you recall. And we made a commitment to make those funds whole, and this is that first effort to do that. So it's a new program because it is not the old parish matching program through Restore. It's going to be state surplus funding, matching with the parishes, but it's akin to that. It's supposed to go towards matching with the parishes on their projects. It's going to be another reimbursement grant, similar to the Partnership Fund, but again, not the Partnership Fund. We have roughly $6 million. I don't have the exact figure in front of me. I think it's either at 6 or a little north of 6 million to match on the projects, and we want that money to really be able to help the parishes leverage their funds, either their in-house funds, their other grants, their other monies, as well as use this potentially for a carrot on future grant applications. There might be some, the one example we've thrown around in kind of the conceptual development of this is, maybe some of the future NCRF, the Coastal Resiliency grants. Maybe this can be used as match for that. I can't promise that right now because we're still in development, but those are some of the ideas we're floating around. And we do intend to develop this and make more details available to you, hopefully by the, but towards the later portion of the calendar year, maybe October, November timeframe. We want to have this thing developed, ready to roll out, and we certainly will give a better briefing on the details. But for now, this is just hey, be thinking of projects, know that this is coming, and don't tell us you're surprised when it happens, because I just told you about it. So that's kind of That's kind of the nitty gritty there. So I will happily take questions on both programs. Partnership fund was the first thing, parish matching. I won't have as many answers for you on the parish matching at this point, unfortunately, but those will be coming with time.
All right, thank you, Kent. Appreciate that update, and I'll just make a couple of comments and certainly take any questions from the board. But we are very excited to be able to announce a partnership program. That's something, in addition to the parish matching program, of course, that was made possible due to the fact that the coastal program continues to be supported by the legislature and by this administration through the allocation of surplus dollars. So that's the source of funds for both of these projects. Or both of these programs, and so just want to make sure we thank those that are responsible for that. It also provides just a really good opportunity to leverage additional dollars and to provide some opportunities, in the case at least of the matching program, for parishes to be able to leverage those dollars against other grants, as Mr. Bolfras mentioned, that they may be able to apply for. So any questions from the board for Mr. Bolfras? All right, Ken, thank you very much. We will move on to agenda item number 9, a briefing on the impact of Sackett versus EPA on coastal Louisiana. Mr. David Peterson.
Good morning, everyone. I feel like I'm here. Over the years, I've done a couple of presentations on Waters of the U.S. or WOTUS. It's sort of a continuing saga back and forth in terms of actually what Waters of the U.S. means and the definitions of that. There's been a series of litigations over the years and regulations. There was the pre-2015 regulations that were in place. They were revised by the Obama administration, then challenged, and there was a series of injunctions and things as that litigation came forth. Then when the Trump administration came in, they changed those regulations, and there was sort of this shifting back and forth in terms of the extent of the coverage of what was going to be regulated. And then after challenges to the Trump regulations, then came a series of regulations from the current Biden administration, which was then challenged. And there's currently at least 2 pending cases out there. One, I believe, is in Idaho, and one that's in Texas. And I'll give you an update kind of on where those stand. And then, sort of in the interim, the Sackett case has been kind of working its way through the courts. It was up and down to the Supreme Court and then back. And then finally, we've had this decision on Sackett. And the Sackett was kind of involved some folks who had done some work at their home. They were fined by EPA and told that they were wetlands. They challenged that and the extent of what EPA could actually regulate. And so that at the end of May resulted in Supreme Court decision in Sackett, which I think, in terms of talking about the back and forth that we've had on the waters of the U.S., has just created more chaos on top of the chaos that we've had and where things stand. I guess at this point there's another. The good thing is you had the Rapinos case, which was a plurality opinion, which didn't get a majority of the Supreme Court, so everybody has over the years been trying to figure out what that meant, going back to the pre-2015 rules. And so at least now there's a majority opinion that sort of defines things, but the question is kind of where we go. And I think, just to give brief, Waters of the U.S. essentially is kind of what the regulatory jurisdiction of the EPA and the Corps is as it relates to the Clean Water Act. That's really what we're talking about. There's a lot of different pieces to the Clean Water Act. I think the biggest thing that most folks think about is dealing with 404 permitting from the Corps. I think most of the folks in this room are probably more familiar with that, but there's discharge permitting that DEQ is involved in, and some other things that sort of come into what the regulation is. This diagram is sort of what is the current state of the regulations based on the two cases that are out there. There is the Idaho case, which is sort of everything in purple, and the judge essentially said you got to go back to the pre-2015 rules. There's and the Texas case. Then the other states weren't involved in the litigation, and those are the current rules that were in place. However, with the Sackett opinion, that's kind of thrown all of that in limbo, because essentially that case is questioning even the 2023 rules from the Biden administration and where that stands. I think looking at the pre-2015 rule, which is kind of what's in most of the states currently, you have to have a contiguous bordering or neighboring and a traditional navigable water. The key here that Sackett looked at is that you have to have this significant nexus with the traditional navigable water, and that's where the court, essentially in the case, really hit EPA and the Corps, saying that they had just gone way further than Congress had intended in terms of regulations. And I think that the striking part of the Sackett case is, while it's a 5-4 decision on the majority opinion, all of the court concluded that the Sacketts, the EPA and the Corps, had gone too far regarding the Sacketts, which and the details of which I think they were maybe filling in a ditch in the back of their property or something, and it had some, very sort of tenuous connection to a lake that was 30 miles away and wasn't even technically maybe a federal navigable waterway. It was an interstate waterway versus interstate. And so looking at that was the curious opinion was, I think everybody agreed that EPA had gone way too far as it related to the Sacketts and some of the things that were being regulated. I think, most people think, a lot of people in Louisiana have ditches in front of their houses or behind their houses, and this probably extended WOTUS all the way to the ditch behind your house that you probably cut the grass in or something. And nobody, I think, there expected the EPA to come in and start regulating on those things. So that's the interesting thing. But the disagreement with the members of the court is, to what extent should the federal government be regulating these waters? Clearly, the court, they rejected this significant nexus rule. They felt like the way it had been applied, that had gone too far. So the court goes through, one of the things, like I said, there's a long thing about, they go through the history of the Supreme Court continuing to sort of pull back the EPA and the Corps. Every time they have a regulation, they always say they go too far and they have to continue to pull them back. So here they make a big thing of what are traditional waters of the U.S. And essentially what they're talking about is kind of what you would talk about as a navigable waterway, and really talking about streams, ocean, rivers, and lakes. The court also seems to talk about there may be a distinction even between areas of water that are purely an intrastate water that has no connection to interstate commerce. They go into discussions of interstate commerce. So there's a question of kind of where that probably lies, but what's a navigable water and how we go from there. But I think the big thing that everybody is concerned about, I think we can figure out what a navigable waterway is. That's sort of traditional definitions in the law. What the court did, though, is they said they looked at what is an adjacent wetland in the statute, and that's sort of where the distinguished part of it is. About what they say is it has to be indistinguishable part of a body of water that itself constitutes a WOTUS. And that's where they have probably now created additional chaos, because they don't necessarily give a lot of definitions about that. They talk about that connection has to be a part where it's difficult to determine where the water ends and the wetland begins. From a practical standpoint, I still think probably most of South Louisiana, south of I-10 and the I-12 corridor, is probably a good bet that that's a wetland that has connections either to the Gulf in some way or the, Lake Pontchartrain, those areas, and Mississippi River. But one of the things they talk about is you have to have this uninterrupted connection with the traditional navigable waterway. That's where they certainly have opened up the door as to what's the interpretation of that going to be. How is EPA going to look at that? One of the things, part of the discussion is they have this discussion about artificially cut off waterways or wetlands, which to Louisiana and a lot of folks in this room, how do you deal with a levee at that point that's cut it off? They say, well, if there's somebody cut off the wetland deliberately and in a criminal matter, certainly that's not going to not make it a wetland. They don't really give a whole lot of discussion about things like the core levees, those things, any levee artificially cutting off those wetlands. I think in particular we've had a lot of discussions since this case came out with folks about, how are they going to look at what we call leaky levees, where you have a levee that's only closed off during a storm event, but you have connections where you maintain the opening of bayous and those things. Not really clear where that's going to be. There's a concurring opinion by Justice Kavanaugh that I feel like, in my reading of it, makes a lot to do about nothing on the difference between, essentially they're saying that the majority opinion says everything that's an adjoining wetland versus an adjacent wetland. I tend to think that's making a happy out of a glad in terms of comparing terms. I don't think it gives any further guidance, but they talk about this doom and gloom that everything, particularly they talk about the levees. I think Kavanaugh is talking about the again, as I call it, the chaos, additional chaos that's been created, but I'm not sure that Kavanaugh's doom and gloom in the opinion is going to be the reality. I think, again, how is EPA and the Corps going to step back, look at this, and work through it? And I think that sort of gets us to sort of the point of, what are you going to look at now? The Corps, right after the opinion, and the EPA essentially issued some notifications that, they're suspending the determinations of jurisdiction, and they're essentially processing the Sackett opinion. More recently, just in the last week or so, EPA has now issued, which I don't have on the presentation because this was from the last meeting that we had, but essentially they said EPA and the U.S. Army are in the receipt of the Supreme Court's May 25th, 2023 decision in Sackett. And it says, in light of this decision, the agencies are interpreting the phrase, waters of the United States, consistent with the Supreme Court's decision in Sackett. No clue what that means. The agency, and I think the important thing is it says the agencies are developing a rule to amend the final revised definitions of waters of the United States rule published in the Federal Register on January 18th, 2023, consistent with the Sackett decision. The agency intend to issue a final rule by September 1st, 2023. That's a very ambitious timeline, I think, in terms of how you look at this, because I've looked at the the current rules, and I think getting the current rules revised in any meaningful manner by September 1st in light of the second opinion is going to be really tough. Now, and I think sort of on top of that, we'll wait for those rules to come in. I'm assuming they'll have to. I'm not really sure what that revision means. Are they planning on going through the usual rulemaking process in terms of getting comments in that period of time, which the timelines I'm looking at, most people say ambitiously that would get us to a final rule in January, early next year in 2024. At that point, I don't know. Or are they going to issue some kind of emergency interim rule? Really don't know what that means. That was issued as of last week. The EPA also, in the two cases, the Idaho, the Texas case, they have asked for a stay in both of those cases so that they don't move forward. And they've at least said to the court what's said in this statement that was issued by the EPA and the Corps, that they plan to have regulations by September 1st. So the Texas case, a stay has been issued by the court as of Monday of this week. The one in the Idaho case is still pending, and as of at least this morning, I hadn't seen anything that's been issued by the court in terms of moving those cases forward. Logically, that's probably the right thing for the courts to do, because if the rule's going to change, it could change how the court looks at it. And that's kind of where we are right now. And like I say, there's a lot more questions folks are asking. I said I spent yesterday looking at some of the most recent writings and opinions for folks on it, and nobody really at this point in time is giving anything that I think is any more significant than what you can get out of the opinion. A lot of folks are saying that we're going to wait and see what EPA does. Like I said, I think certainly there are going to be wetlands that are considered jurisdictional wetlands today. I think particularly dealing with some that may be behind areas that are levied and things in Louisiana that are going to have an impact. I think there's going to be ones that under the current rules, this connection where you've got isolated wetlands, it might impact some things in North Louisiana where you've got wetlands that are isolated and don't have these direct continuous connections to some navigable river. And so that kind of stuff, I don't know, say a prairie pothole in Minnesota that's considered a wetland now, that's an isolated wetland, might not be there. There has been a lot of gymnastics. I think as we've looked through the comments, I know I've worked with Dwayne on some of those, looking at the comments and trying to craft comments for this agency and for the state and the levee boards to sort of look at that, where we think they had gone too far in some circumstances in saying what was a jurisdictional wetland. There's certainly, the Supreme Court says you better look at this real close and draw it back. Now, where they draw that line, how it's drawn, I don't really know. I think it's going to be the same process that we've seen over the last probably 30 years in terms of looking at it from a scientific perspective. How do you interpret this rule, which is somewhat vague, to do that? I think what's going to also be interesting is the court really, they hammer the EPA and the Corps for going too far, well beyond what the court thinks was the intent of Congress. There is another case that they just put on the docket for next year that the court's going to look at, that is to look at what they call the Chevron doctrine, which is a doctrine which gives great deference to agencies, federal agencies, and how they interpret federal law. There's been some indication the court is been wanting to look at Chevron for a few years, and I think that may, on top of this, have some significance. And I think it's going to probably if I'm at EPA, I'm certainly in the Corps. I'm certainly going to take some caution into how far I go with this, and where it goes. And as we've seen, like I said, over the years, what administration is in at the presidential seat there also has sort of determined where these things have gone back and forth. But I don't think it's ended, because I think if you get a decision that draws back on the Chevron case, gives left deference to the agencies, next year it could throw anything that EPA or the Corps develops could get further thrown into sort of chaos by that. But I would hope that they're looking at that and being very cautious and come up with some more well-defined rules than they really currently have from that perspective. But at this point, that's kind of where we are, and if anybody has any other questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
All right, David, thank you very much. Certainly there seem to be more questions than answers at this point, and Mr. Bourgeois, it looks like, has a question.
Yeah, I mean, questions, hundreds of them, but the reality is I think your assessment of things was correct in your presentation, and it was really well done. I think a couple of things that people need to remember is that in this ruling, they didn't change the definition of a wetland. They just changed the definition of what's a jurisdictional wetland, right? So we know there's a bunch of wetlands all over Louisiana that are wetlands. Now, whether they're jurisdictional to the Corps or not becomes really what this is about. I think that Kavanaugh's remember, so the plurality from, was it
Rapinos?
Yeah, well, I mean, in Rapinos they followed not the plurality but Kennedy's significant nexus, introducing a whole new term into the state of the art. But in this case, was it Alito's, Scalise, who was the majority opinion? I forget who wrote it. Was very, very clear that this was textually based off of what was happening in Congress at the time, and that Kennedy took it too far with a significant nexus. My point in all of this is Kavanaugh's predictions, I think, were a bit overboard. I mean, I think that most of what we know as a wetland in Louisiana that's outside and has interchange and everything else is not going to be impacted by this ruling. What is inside of the levee systems currently, state-wise, the Department of Natural Resources recognizes if it's inside of a levee system in a forced drainage area, then it's a fast land. And this would put basically federal law kind of along those same lines, that the levees stop the continuous surface connection to it. The problem with all of it is it's really, here we go again, right? A person who's the person who's the head of regulatory at the Corps in New Orleans, who I consider a friend of mine, has often said, we're riding the same roller coaster. We're just in different seats, right? And I think that that's where we're going to be with this process right now. The Corps, because this is actually an EPA rule that the Corps has the pleasure of being the enforcement arm for, is going to be thrown into a tizzy for a while. And so I think that we're going to have to be prepared when we're looking for permits and things like that to see things that are going to cause delays, and we're going to have to try to find some workarounds on those type of things. I do not see them having this sorted out by that time frame, but I think there is we moved the ball with this opinion in a more definitive direction than we left it with Rapinos, right? I think we've got something a little better to work from if everybody wants to work in those terms. How it impacts us in the short term is going to be challenging for us from that point of view. So I just wanted to throw those things in there. The final thing that I would say that we're going to have to pay attention to, right? DNR considers the wetlands inside of a forced drainage area to be non-jurisdictional, to be fast lands. The Corps doesn't. meaning that if someone inside of a forest drainage area went to develop land that was previously considered a wetland, they won't have to mitigate for it. They'll have less impacts, and they could literally, if this ruling comes off as it looks, develop wetlands inside of our forest drainage areas. And I have to say, this may not be the case in all cases, but some of our forest drainage areas currently are relying on those wetlands as basins inside of the area, and our pump capacities are based off of that. So that's a real world issue that we would potentially have to face, if the law now allows these folks to develop those lands because they're not jurisdictional to the Corps without having to mitigate, then we're going to lose some of our reservoir capacity inside of our forest drainage area. So double-edged sword, just things we have to watch. It could be beneficial to us in our ability to provide protection, because the cost of having to mitigate for wetlands inside the system would be reduced because those wetlands have been severed. But there's just a lot to consider, and I just wanted to add that. And sorry for rambling.
No, and I think you make a good point. Is this is strictly what the jurisdiction will be for the federal government over wetlands. It doesn't change any of the state laws in that regard. I think that's another thing. I think the courts were clear that the states can go beyond and regulate further, and many do. I think there's probably some differences in our state law. I haven't really looked at all the DNR regs, but I think, and again, you've got things that may not be jurisdictional wetlands for us, but are for the Corps currently, that may change. So I think that's going to be sort of part of the things that'll have to be looked at as this gets sorted out. Is our states going to want to come in as an agency? Does CPRA, DNR, wildlife start looking at those things in terms of, do we need to fill in the gap that might be created by this case?
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Bourgeois and David. Any other questions for David? Yeah, I think the forest drainage question you raised is an important one. Will the feds consider an area under pump? Is that pump a continuous connection? And then that leads you to a flap-gated culvert, for example. Is that continuous or not? So it gets nuanced very nuanced very quickly. But we appreciate the update, David, and we know you'll keep us posted as things develop, and we can expect some more updates from David in the near future. So we'll move on to agenda item number 10, update on the Nichols Coastal Center. Dr. Clune. Welcome, Dr. Clune.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was worried I'd have to follow brown pelican migrations, but instead I got Mr. Peterson saving me with EPA regulations. I appreciate that. Just want to give a few updates. The university started this process in 2019, working with Chairman Klein, Governor Edwards, our legislators, and they maintain that momentum throughout this process. As you know, universities weathered COVID-19 and then Hurricane Ida in our case, and then enrollment loss as a result of that, and budget crises as a result of that. And along the entire way, we've had people standing with us, especially CPRA, in making sure this coastal center gets built. We are the closest university to the coast in Louisiana. When we were founded in 1948, we were 50 miles from the coast. Today, we're 24 miles from the coast, so we're getting closer every day. And we have a long history in coastal restoration and coastal research, legendary faculty in oyster research like Dr. Earl Molason, Dr. Marilyn Kiljan. I could go on and on. We have a master's in marine biology, and our newest strategic plan written this year is labeled Louisiana's Coastal University. So we embrace that role as being closest to the coast. So it started in 2019 with a press conference. Governor Edwards focused attention on the Atchafalaya River being a restoration tool for the Terrebonne Basin. We all recognize the criticality of that role and the like. So in a few months after that, the CPRA staff, Bren, I think Rudy, Chip, came down and talked to us about the River Studies Center and how they saw the Coastal Center being a companion to that, basic science-based research on the Atchafalaya, Terrebonne, and Barataria basins. We embraced that, and with the task force, we developed a vision, mission, and plan, and it was a very long and arduous process. It started in person, and it went to Zoom meetings during COVID-19 crisis, but continued throughout, and we focused on where we live, the working coast, and making that resilient, and also picking up on the science-based research and solutions for the coastal region. So what CPRA brought to us was some of the needs of the Atchafalaya Basin, and those had to do with water quality. We have a lot of experience with water quality already in the Atchafalaya Basin, working with the Nature Conservancy there, improve water quality and how it impacts animal production, including crawfish. And we do have Dr. Chris Balvelin, who is very involved in crawfish, and he studies low oxygen levels in the Atchafalaya Basin. Then there was also the Terrebonne and Barataria basins. Nichols already has research in terms of dredge sediment, the chemistry of dredge sediment, how that sediment is used. Primarily we study ridges and how that sediment over time evolves for vegetation. Also, the Barrier Islands, we have a geomatics program. We fly drones over Barrier Islands to look at plantings, the success of plantings. We've conducted multiple plantings, including black mangrove plantings on the Barrier Islands in the Terrebonne Basin. And of course, oyster reefs. I talked about our experience with oyster research over the years. We've studied and investigated the structure and ecological function of different types of structures for living shorelines. And in wetland ecology, we have a number of field studies ongoing, and we'll have a number more. So after that, we started talking to Dwayne Bourgeois about the needs of the levee districts and the ports, and Dwayne helped me kind of understand the importance of the applied side of this center. We are really the applied version here, and so having to do with levee construction, the stability of it, the materials used, looking at leaky levees and other projects in like optimum pump off elevations, and then how are these things financed and how should they be financed. So after we had done that outreach, we had to plan a DDG, sit down and do a strategic planning process with our task force. And that task force consisted of members from the university, from industry partners, local agencies, and they worked tirelessly over several months to come up with a planning document for the Coastal Center. One of the things they had to decide is where do you put the thing on Nichols campus. So they looked at a number of sites. One is we have a school for students with dyslexia on our campus, Max Charter. We have Coach Tim Rubo's practice field, and we have another area on Bowie Road, which is the driving range for our golf team. Everything was a slight inconvenience. I'm not sure we ever told the school we were looking at the site where the school sits, but the other ones were more doable. They settled on the football practice field for a couple reasons, one of which it's accessible to our science buildings. It's just a few minutes walk from our Go Hall Science Building. You don't have to cross the intersection of Bowie Road. It's very close, and the driving range is on the other side of Bowie Road. So they settled on Coach Rebo's practice field. So this is what the footprint looks like on that field. It has a retention pond off to the right, and then the coastal center, which is about 40,000 square feet. That includes 6 labs, 6 large labs, 4 smaller ones, exhibit spaces, gallery, atrium, and then about a 5,000 square foot conference center as well. And this all had to do with talking to the CPRA team, talking to Rudy. Rudy was on the task force, explaining the importance of having conference space, having exhibit space in this coastal center. Tim Rebo, I will say, he's not been too poorly treated. He will get a 100-yard covered practice field where he'll be moving come August. It's been an interesting process. We play FCS football. We don't play FBS. We're not LSU. So Tim Rebo went out one day for practice, and they were doing core samples in the middle of his practice field, and they explained they could not move the stakes. So being Coach Rebo, he just relocated to another field to practice. But he'll take over this 100-yard covered facility that is another capital outlay project with a field funded by the Manning family and the Shaw Group. So the coastal center looks something like this. You see off to the left, that's the conference center. Off to the right or the lab spaces, the large labs, the smaller labs. In the middle, you'll see the atrium, and the biggest open space in the atrium is the exhibit space. And so we've been raising money for exhibits to go into that building. On the second floor, you have some more offices, conference rooms. On the left side, you'll see the second floor, which is not a finished space. This is a shell that's been built out. We've written a grant to Congressman Garrett Graves for a community grant to finish out that second floor space. Right now, as I said, it's just a shell. We're working on that. That would be home to our coastal family partners like Betnep, Restore Retreat, and others, that space on the second floor. So we're very interested in getting that built out. So the task force did a lot of work, and they started from the inside out. So first they designed the floor plan, what needed to go into the building, and then they focused on the wrapping. So the task force, after all the work was done, they came up with this rendering here. A beautiful building. They used some limestone, some copper, and arches to match our building, and some coastal elements such as the aluminum panels and the like. So we took this and we never changed a bit of the floor plan. The floor plan worked perfect for us. We do have a campus master plan that's pretty strict in the materials we can use on the Nicholls State University campus. We had to bring it in line with that. We use a lot of dark brown metal. We use certain colors of aluminum panels, and we have a very distinctive Nicholls brick blend that we use on every campus building. So we adjusted some of those things but kept the floor plan exactly the same in that space. So another component of that is having to raise money for the exhibits. We're on our way. We're not there yet, but we've been raising money from industry partners and agencies and the like to build out an exhibit. Now, we're not going to have a river model like the River Study Center. We don't have a physical model. We'll have a digital model. We'll have a number of other factors in there. We're trying to, we have a children's museum about 5 minutes from here, so we don't want to do what they do. We want to do something different and reach a different age group, but that is an ongoing process. Brent, do you remember who we're working with? I think it's X Plus. Is that the group that did the river studies? I think that's it.
Yes, that's correct.
That's right. Okay, and then the other thing is we have a thriving esports team. We compete against the big schools in video gaming, varsity video gaming, and from that we developed a relationship with some video game designers who left the video game world and began working on real world problems, and they formed a company called Balance Media Technology, and their interest was in gathering large amounts of data, unifying that data, cleaning that data, and making it available to researchers. So we have a partnership with them to create the Coastal Data Refinery, and we're working on that to make disparate data available to researchers on the coast. So we're very excited about that. And finally, I just want to talk about next steps here. So we're looking at the governor's availability for a groundbreaking for the Coastal Center in mid to late August. The bid was awarded to Ratcliffe Construction Company. We had a lot of bids come in. It was very encouraging. We've had a number of projects we've bid and rebid during the COVID-19 crisis and then post-Hurricane Ida, and we always came in overbid. We'd bid 2-3 times. Surprisingly, this bid came in under budget, which is almost unheard of. So the original base bid was $15.1 million, with the alternates, which includes an upstairs terrace, more parking, higher end materials inside the building. It came in at 15.8, so that leaves us a little wiggle room there. We're going to try to do a wall system on the second floor that we don't have yet built out in the Coastal Center in order to get all of it done at one time. The executive director search, Dwayne and Rudy and some others are on that executive director search. It's underway. It's been extended, I think, until August for the final. They've had some strong, very strong candidates, a limited number of candidates, and that's been extended. And that should wrap up about the same time that we do the ground or shovel turning on the Coastal Center. So with that, I'll stop. I just want to, again, express my thanks to everyone who's worked on this with CPRA, the legislature, the governor, to make it to this point. And I think that's it. I'll pause to see if there are any questions about Nichols Coastal Center.
Yeah,
Mr. Bourgeois.
I hate to be the guy that's commenting after everything, but in this one, I'll keep it very short. As a graduate from Nichols, I can't say how exciting this is and how much I appreciate everybody's help in making this reality. And I'm committed, as Dr. Clooney is, to make sure that this center gives some real-world deliverables that we can all benefit from. And that's all I wanted to add to that.
Any other questions or comments from the board? Well, thank you, Dr. Clune. I would just reiterate that we're excited to be working with the closest to the coast. It's good to see those renderings, excited to see the groundbreaking take place, and would reiterate and remind folks that the search is ongoing for that executive director, and get your resumes in. Thank you. All right, last but not least, we will hear from our favorite federal updater, Neil McMillan. Please come to the table.
Good morning, Board and Chairman. Going to look today with a deep dive into the federal appropriations process, since there's a lot going on there that have impact to, say, Louisiana as well as the Army Corps, and then we'll touch on a few other things like the RISE Act and the IIJA implementation. So, at September 30th, the federal government runs out of authorized funding, so that's the beginning of FY24, and for years Congress has not paid attention to the normal calendar for funding the government, resulting in a lot of delay, slowdowns, and really massive bills called omnibus bills, where they fund all 12 spending accounts at once. It results in what's become a $1.7 trillion bill, and there's a lot in there, and a lot of folks, particularly on the fiscal conservative side, have thought that's a really poor way of doing things, and there's a real desire to go back to regular order. And that's what we saw playing out in the debt ceiling fight that got resolved in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So now they, as in Congress, have said, we're going to get back to how we're supposed to do it, try to pass these all on time, individually, consider each theme together. And that's going to be very challenging because Congress has really shrank the amount of days in the week they're in. and then they're up against a big time crunch. So that the goal of getting back to normal was hard enough, but they also decided we're going to cut spending, which is something that Congress is not in the habit of doing. And there are they came to a begrudging agreement to slightly reduce spending to the fiscal year before, and in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And so that passes, and they're breathing a sigh of relief, saying, all right, we got our numbers, we can go. And then the House Freedom Caucus, the kind of hardline Republicans, said, well, we agreed to a cap, a ceiling. We actually want something much lower than the max of the cap. And so now, in addition to having a time crunch, a Congress that's way out of practice to doing these steady considerations bills, you have a broad spending level disagreement on discretionary non-defense funding. So that's where we come into play on the discretionary non-defense side. So not entitlements, not defense, but kind of the rest of the pie. And so we'll kind of show you kind of what that could mean for a few of the projects we care the most about. But first then I guess I'll mention that a government shutdown or protracted continuing resolutions that keep things steady, that could actually result in a 1% spending cut across the board if that's continued into next year, are real possibilities. So expect future reports to have more drama about this. But right now they're giving it their best to try to be on timely. In the House Appropriations Committee, at the end of this week, we'll have done, I guess, 2/3 of their bills. And the Senate Appropriations will have almost done half and do 5 of their 12. And that's pretty great progress, especially from the Senate. The Senate hasn't even passed any appropriations bills in certain fiscal years in recent memory. So they are active, and they are trying to meet it. And that's going to help us know it's coming in a better way. And provide just some links to folks for if there's, because there's different funding bills that apply to us. Probably the most important is energy and water with the Army Corps funding, but Homeland Security covers FEMA. Ag has a lot of conservation programs. Commerce has NOAA funding. Then Interior and Environment do EPA and Department of Interior. So there's coastal relevance in all of those. And so here's how this is total discretionary funding, and some big numbers, a lot of numbers in this chart. And what I'm really trying to show here is the divide in the House and Senate's current plan. So if you look at the bottom right corner, you'll see that the Senate's kind of agreeing to $12 billion less than last year. So that means $12 billion, that's some belt tightening, but they think that's manageable. On the House side, it's $130 billion, and really far more if you take out the defense. And so that's where folks are saying that's a really dramatic cut. We're not going to stomach that. And so depending on how hard the House holds that position, we could see a shutdown coming for real, or something like that. Highlighted in kind of a different green are the most important accounts to us: commerce, justice, energy and water, interior and environment. Energy and water, which has the Army Corps and a lot of defense funding from the nuclear side, you'll see that Congress is pretty steady with that and actually has strong budgets. So that's good news from the Army Corps side. But where the discretionary funding that we like to see for NOAA and Interior and EPA, very significant cuts, particularly on the House side. So kind of underscores how unique the opportunity of the IIJA and IRA are. And so, yeah, so there's not only are you trying to go fast again and consider everything again, but we have a very dramatic House and Senate dispute resurrected, and the House Republicans that are in the majority are kind of divided. So things are tense, but we'll see kind of what Coastal can get out of those programs. So we'll look at the first one that's passed the House committee that's most important to us, the House Energy and Water Appropriations Committee. And this one's really interesting and kind of brings out a lot of kind of themes here, because you'll see that major increases for the Army Corps are in this bill, and it'd be funding at record levels for a yearly Corps budget. 9.5 billion, which is 1.25 billion more than last year, and over 2 billion more than the president's budget. So that's huge increase percentage wise, and also has a lot of that's going to construction. So it's not just a lot of deferred maintenance; it's a lot of new projects, which is really important for us as we're onboarding new things. But it's funded. That surplus is funded through clawing back the White House and House Democrats. Kind of one of their pride and joy is the Inflation Reduction Act that had a lot of climate spending. So the largesse is kind of based off taking something that's fiercely opposed. You'll see they took off about almost $6 billion from electric appliance rebates, funding for building codes, funding for training. And so that's, I guess, an encouraging and discouraging situation of, yes, we're getting Congress to show that core construction is very, very important and worth plussing up. But then the way they did that is, I guess, a fiercely contested budget gimmick. And there's not, with these caps, there's not too much fund to just grow core funding without taking from either something outside like this did, or taking from Department of Energy or our nuclear defense space. So the Corps is constrained, and this clawback could be a really great way to boost it up, but we'll see if it lasts. So a lot of what I'm presenting on will have positive core numbers, but we don't know if that'll go forward. Then one other big theme I noticed is that there are some very large community project funding, so earmarks for core projects in this bill. There's one that's $236 million. There's a couple at $100 million, one at $75 million. These are really large chunks. And looking into the type of projects those are for inland waterway projects. A lot of things funded through the trust fund that historically have not been specifically budgeted for. And so a lot of our flood risk and storm damage reduction projects or ecosystem restoration projects aren't parallel to those type of needs, but at the same time, it's shown that there is some appetite for members putting very large numbers and getting a thumbs up. So I think that's really important as we keep onboarding $4 billion projects to start seeing some really, really large numbers, going all the way through. So focusing in on Louisiana's impact, there are a good bit of community project funding requests that are helpful. Some for investigations on Bayou Sorrel Lock and Home Navigation Canal. There's, I guess, good items from the president's budget on Calcasieu River and Pass, LCA, and the Lower Mississippi River Comprehensive Study, as well as funding to advance the study for Lafitte, which is nice to see. And then the biggest earmark for Coastal Louisiana is the $28 million for Merganza to the Gulf, flexible for perhaps Reach A, Reach F. Good to see that continue. And then there's also some additional funding for O&M for the Mermentau, thanks to Higgins' work. So all that seems solid. Unfortunately, the Corps didn't express capability for a lot of important projects to Coastal, like the Mr. Go project, South Central Coastal, Upper Barataria risk reduction. A couple of those were just authorized under WRDA, so it's kind of have to ramp it up. But the committee is very deferential to what the Corps says it can do. So the Corps got a lot of work, as we've heard, and unfortunately that means they're not necessarily going to lean forward and say, throw us a larger allocation. They're trying to show they can spend what they got. But hopefully in subsequent fiscal years, they'll show a greater willingness and give our delegation more options to plus up and use their considerable influence. And then some interesting stuff outside of project-specific funding is that Congress is trying to direct the administration to use excess funding from the infrastructure bill to finish out or support projects supported through the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 that have significant progress, such as a signed agreement. And as you see from the map of the studies there, those 6 studies, and the list of projects in that bottom left corner, Louisiana has a lot of interest in funding those projects. So that, I think that prioritization and depending on how much money is left in the infrastructure bill could be a really nice provision for Louisiana down the road as the Corps releases work plans. And then in the bottom right, you'll see there is some report language from the committee. It's not binding, but certainly encouraging, that Congresswoman Letlow put forward is just to prioritize restoring the Mr. Go in future budget submissions. So, that's something that we've now activated, that the cost share is 100% federal, and we're hoping to start aggressively do major projects through that. And so that was the funding side of the Corps, but I'll also note that the authorization policy side of the Corps is coming up, even though we just passed WRDA 2022 in December. Congressional offices are probably going to start asking for priorities later this month or in August. Both committees in the House and Senate have done a budget oversight hearing with Corps leadership, so they're laying the groundwork. What folks told me is that they want it to be a pretty simple WRDA, moving projects on to the next stage, not really changing too much policy, because last WRDA was so policy heavy, particularly on the coastal side, and trying to, they want that to go forward. But at the same time, we're not going to not give them exciting ideas for Louisiana. So we're not going to sit this one out, as convenient as that would be for the committees to not deal with Louisiana and all our needs and ambitions. Shifting to the RISE Act, we actually have better news than this slide because we got a new co-sponsor last night as well. But just showing that there's steadily support growing in the House, we added those 5 members with some New York focus, which is nice to see, as well as Rep. Chantel Brown from Ohio. So great to see a Great Lakes member joining that, as well as the lady from Pennsylvania, since there is some resonance for the Great Lakes, and that's been a hard area for us to show that there's value, because it's a different degree. But long way to go there, but glad to see some momentum, particularly in June. Focusing on IIJ and IRA updates, we're kind of tracking 3 big challenges that kind of have action items in August. One is the Coastal Zone Management Habitat Protection Restoration Competition. This is for our bread and butter coastal restoration projects or land conservation. You'll see kind of letters of intent are due in August, so we're working closely with DNR to identify the best projects for that and submitting. USDOT has a discretionary competitive program called Protect. There's a formula side that LADOTD is running with really well, but this discretionary one's open to a lot more stakeholders. Definitely, they're trying to emphasize natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions that kind of support evacuation routes. So there's kind of some neat synergies there that we're learning about. And then a really big opportunity with NOAA, the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. We're seeing that they're something we had challenged NOAA is to do larger projects because they had called transformational projects stuff in between the 10 and 15 million. And we know from their work with NERDA and other projects like that they can do much larger projects, especially in Louisiana. So we're seeing that this collaborative challenge could be up to 75 million, probably not to that size, but we're glad to see that. It's really not a single location grant opportunity. It's about collaboration and regional efforts. So we're kind of scanning the whole coast to see kind of where we can come up with the broadest, most impactful application that would resonate with the criteria. And so application is not due in August 21st. That was some bad information I had. That's just a letter of intent. It's in 2024 when the final application's due. And then I'll close with this awesome announcement that's connected to the IRA funding. NOAA is going to build 2 new research vessels in Homa at Thomas E. Marine Constructors. They're going to kind of continue and deepen their relationship with that shipyard. And I just think it's so interesting that these ships that'll do research, up to the Arctic, in the Pacific, all over on the East Coast, national, international resonance are kind of built within the footprint of some of our top projects like Morgan's of the Gulf system that protects their workforce and assets. And, we're going to always trying to show how Louisiana restoration and protection has national benefits. And I think working with NOAA, which is really beloved in a lot of the coastal areas of the country, will be a great example. And hopefully we'll see more things like this to come. And that with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, Neil. Again, thank you for that update. Lots of good information there, and certainly interesting story and a happy announcement there at the end. So appreciate that. Any comments or questions from the board for Mr. McMillan? All right, Neil. Looks like you're off the hook. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Well, we will move into the public comment period for today's meeting. I've got one card, one public comment. If you'd like to speak, there's some blank cards. I think Ms. Kinchin has some, and we have some at the door. Please fill those out. But the one I've got is from Mr. Doug Daigle with the Louisiana Hypoxia Working Group. I would like to speak about Gulf hypoxia. Doug.
Thank you. I'm Doug Daigle with the Louisiana Hypoxia Working Group. And what I wanted to speak about today is that we're approaching several what might be called accountability points for Louisiana with the hypoxia issue. And the one maybe coming up most immediately is that on February 20th, 2020, Governor Edwards released his second-term coastal priorities. And one of those was a renewed commitment to reducing nutrient pollution into the Mississippi River. Even though it doesn't mention hypoxia, it was widely understood that that's what it was referring to. So as we approach the conclusion of Governor Edwards' administration, it seems appropriate to get some kind of assessment or report on how this commitment has been met. So the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities is the state's official representative on the Hypoxia Task Force. I'm making this request today into the public record, and I'm planning to write them a letter also making the request. But a CPRA meeting seems an appropriate venue for a presentation, a report to be made for that. And I'm not sure on the timeline, except that, if we wait till December, it's kind of late for anything to be addressed that may come up with that. Coinciding with that is an issue that I've raised before, which is for about the past 5 years, the trustee implementation group for the BP Nerdist settlement has been sitting on $10.5 million that was specifically dedicated to non-point source nutrient pollution to the Gulf. And my understanding is that this group called TIG met recently. I couldn't attend the meeting, but I heard from someone who was there that the nutrient issue was not discussed. So I'm just raising here, since CPRA is on that group, when can that issue be resolved, who is making the decisions, and I'm just putting that out for follow-up, asking that issue be addressed.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Daigle. As you know, our policy is not to respond to comments. I'm happy to discuss this with you.
I'm just putting this into the
following
public
the
record
meeting.
today. Right. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Okay. One last thing. A note of personal gratitude for board members and members of the public and helping me get through my first meeting as chair. But also to note that we'll resume our regular schedule through the end of the year. Third Wednesday of the month. Next meeting will be August 16th, if I have that correctly. We're likely or planning to be in Houma. So with that, unless there's anything else from the board, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Ms. Gotro, second, Mr. Hidalgo. Any opposed? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you all.